Behind the fangs in fiction, close your eyes and picture Dracula. You see him clearly, don't you? Pale aristocratic features, dark hair slicked back, a sweeping cape, fangs gleaming as he prepares to drink blood from an innocent victim's neck. He stands in the doorway of his castle in Transylvania, immortal and terrifying, the most famous vampire in history, a creature of pure fiction, a monster from the realm of imagination and gothic horror. But what if I told you that Dracula was real? Not the vampire, of course. Creatures that transform into bats and fear garlic exist only in stories and superstition. But the man who inspired the legend, the historical figure whose name became forever linked with darkness and terror, he walked the earth as flesh and blood. He ruled a kingdom. He fought wars. He committed acts of such shocking cruelty that his reputation echoed through the centuries, transforming him from a medieval prince into the archetype of supernatural evil. His name was Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, Vlad Dracula. And his true story is more complex, more fascinating, and in many ways more terrifying than any vampire tale ever written. Tonight, we are going to uncover the real story behind the Dracula legend. We will travel back to 15th century Eastern Europe, to a world caught between empires, where survival required ruthlessness and compassion could be fatal. We will meet the man behind the monster, explore the forces that shaped him, and discover how a medieval ruler became transformed into literature's most enduring creature of the night. We will separate fact from fiction, history from horror, the real Vlad from the Count. And in doing so, we will find that truth is often stranger and more compelling than any invented tale. Before we begin this journey into the dark corners of medieval history, I want to ask a small favor. If you're ready to explore the real story behind one of the world's most famous monsters, tap that like button. It helps this video reach others who might find these evening explorations into history as fascinating as you do. And if you want to make this a regular part of your night, subscribe to the channel. I create videos like this several times a week, each designed to fill your mind with compelling true stories while helping you drift peacefully toward rest. Now, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? Are you in bed in London as midnight approaches, sitting comfortably in Bucharest near where our story unfolds, relaxing on a couch in Chicago as evening settles in? I love seeing how this community of history enthusiasts connects people across the world. Get comfortable now. Adjust your pillow. Let your shoulders drop and relax. Let your breathing slow naturally. Perhaps turn on some gentle background noise, if that helps you settle. Tonight we travel to 15th century Wallachia, to a land of mountains and forests, of Orthodox churches and Ottoman invasions, where princes ruled by the sword and died by it. Our journey begins not with Vlad himself, but with the turbulent world he was born into. To understand the man, we must first understand his times, the impossible pressures that shaped him, the brutal realities that made cruelty seem like survival. Let us step back now to the year 1431, to a fortress in Transylvania, to the birth of a child who would grow up to become one of history's most notorious rulers. A child born into violence. The stone walls of Sigashora Fortress rise from the Transylvanian hills, weathered by centuries of rain and snow, their towers standing watch over narrow medieval streets that wind through the old town. In the cold winter of 1431, within those protective walls, a woman gave birth to her second son. The child was named Vlad after his father, Vlad II, who had recently been inducted into a secretive chivalric order that would define his son's destiny. The Order of the Dragon was founded by Sigismund of Luxembourg, King of Hungary and Holy Roman Emperor, as a brotherhood of knights dedicated to defending Christianity against the expanding Ottoman Empire. Members wore a medallion showing a dragon curled around itself, and they took solemn oaths to fight the infidel and protect Christendom from Muslim conquest. Because of his membership in this order, Vlad's father became known as Vlad Dracul. In Romanian, Dracul means dragon, though the word carries a double meaning, also suggesting devil. His son, our Vlad, would be called Dracula, meaning son of the dragon, or son of the devil. It was a name heavy with dark connotations, though the infant born that winter could not know how perfectly it would come to fit him. The world Vlad entered was one of perpetual conflict and instability. Wallachia, the principality his father hoped to rule, occupied a precarious position on the map of 15th century Europe. This small territory sat trapped between three great powers, each one vastly more powerful than Wallachia itself. To the west loomed the Kingdom of Hungary, a Christian realm that considered Wallachia part of its sphere of influence. To the south lay the Ottoman Empire, the most formidable military power of the age, expanding relentlessly into Europe after centuries of conquests. To the north and east stretched the Kingdom of Poland and the Principality of Moldavia, each with their own interests and ambitions. Wallachia's importance lay not in its size or wealth, both modest, but in its strategic location. The principality controlled crucial mountain passes through the Carpathian Mountains. It guarded the approaches between Ottoman territories and Christian Europe. Whoever controlled Wallachia controlled a vital buffer zone in the endless war between Islam and Christianity. This meant that being Prince of Wallachia was perhaps the most dangerous political position in medieval Europe. Every prince had to simultaneously manage relationships with multiple overlords, each jealous of their influence. A prince owed fealty to the King of Hungary as a Christian vassal. He also paid tribute to the Ottoman Sultan to avoid invasion. He had to maintain alliances with other Romanian principalities while managing fractious nobility at home. One miscalculation, one perceived betrayal, and a prince could find himself overthrown, imprisoned, or dead. The throne of Wallachia was soaked in blood, changing hands repeatedly through violence and intrigue. Vlad II himself spent years in exile before finally claiming the throne in 1436, when young Vlad was about 5 years old. The family moved from the relative safety of Transylvania to Târgoviște, the capital of Wallachia, where Vlad II established his court in a palace that would later become infamous. Growing up in his father's court, young Vlad received the education expected of a medieval prince. He learned to ride horses and fight with sword and lance. He studied languages, acquiring Romanian, Hungarian, German, and some Latin. He was taught history and theology, learning about the great conflicts between Christianity and Islam, about the fall of Constantinople to the Turks, about the Crusades and the holy duty to defend Christian lands. But he also absorbed harder lessons through observation. He watched his father navigate the treacherous political landscape, making promises to multiple powers that sometimes contradicted each other. He saw how quickly allies became enemies, how easily oaths were broken when circumstances changed. He learned that survival in Wallachia required ruthlessness, cunning, and a willingness to do whatever was necessary. The defining trauma of Vlad's childhood came in 1442, when he was approximately 11 years old. His father, trying to maintain peace with the Ottoman Empire while also keeping Hungarian support, made a decision that would shape Vlad's entire life. To guarantee his loyalty to Sultan Murad II, Vlad Dracula agreed to send 2 of his sons as hostages to the Ottoman court. Vlad and his younger brother Radu were taken from their home and transported to Edirne, the Ottoman capital at that time. They would remain prisoners there for the next 4 to 6 years, their lives held as security for their father's good behavior. This practice of taking political hostages was common in medieval diplomacy. The hostages were usually treated well, educated and raised almost as members of the royal household. But they were still prisoners, acutely aware that their lives depended on decisions made by others, that any rebellion by their father could result in their execution. For Vlad, these years in Ottoman captivity were both formative and deeply traumatic. He was surrounded by people who spoke Turkish, practiced Islam, followed customs completely foreign to him. He was cut off from his family, his home, everything familiar. He was constantly reminded that he was a prisoner, that his life was not his own. The Ottomans provided excellent education to their high-born hostages, training them in the arts of war and governance. Vlad continued his military training, learning Ottoman tactics and strategy. He studied Turkish and Persian languages. He observed how the Ottoman court functioned, how power was maintained through a combination of patronage and fear, how the Sultan commanded absolute loyalty from his officials. But he also witnessed or experienced cruelty. Ottoman justice was swift and harsh. Punishments for disobedience included beatings, torture, and various forms of execution. Among these was impalement, driving a wooden stake through a criminal's body and leaving them to die slowly on display. Vlad would have seen this punishment inflicted, would have understood its power to inspire obedience through terror. His younger brother Radu adapted better to captivity. Radu learned Turkish fluently, embraced Ottoman culture, and became a favorite at court. Some historical sources suggest Radu converted to Islam and may have become the lover of Mehmed, the Sultan's son and future conqueror of Constantinople. Whether this is true or embellished by later chroniclers, Radu clearly thrived in Ottoman service, eventually fighting for the Sultan against his own people. But Vlad remained defiant, resistant, difficult. He refused to fully accept Ottoman ways. He maintained his Christian faith fiercely. He was beaten for his stubbornness, possibly tortured, definitely humiliated. These experiences instilled in him a burning hatred of the Ottomans that would define his later actions. While Vlad suffered in captivity, catastrophe struck his family in Wallachia. His father, Vlad Dracula, tried to maintain his impossible balancing act between Hungary and the Ottomans, but the tensions proved unmanageable. In 1447, Hungarian nobles who felt betrayed by Vlad Dracula's Ottoman connections led a rebellion. They overthrew him, captured both Vlad Dracula and his eldest son Mircea, and killed them both brutally. According to some accounts, Vlad Dracula was buried alive. His son Mircea suffered an even worse fate. He was blinded with red-hot iron stakes and then buried alive at Targovište. The brutality of these deaths, inflicted by men his father had considered allies, taught young Vlad a lesson he would never forget. Trust no one, show no mercy, rule through fear. Vlad learned of his father's and brother's murders while still imprisoned in Edirne. He was now, at about 16 years old, the rightful heir to the Wallachian throne, but he was powerless, a prisoner far from home, unable to claim his inheritance or avenge his family. In 1448, the Ottomans decided Vlad could be useful to them. They supported his claim to the throne, hoping to install a prince who would be grateful and loyal. With Ottoman military backing, Vlad invaded Wallachia and briefly claimed the throne his father had held. But this first reign lasted only 2 months. Vlad's support was too weak, his position too dependent on Ottoman force. When the Ottoman troops withdrew, Vlad was quickly overthrown by rivals backed by Hungarian interests. He fled into exile, beginning 8 years of wandering between Moldavia and Transylvania, constantly seeking support, building alliances, waiting for his opportunity. These years of exile, from 1448 to 1456, transformed Vlad from an inexperienced teenager into a hardened warrior. He fought as a mercenary. He learned patience and planning. He studied his enemies and his potential allies. He developed the ruthless pragmatism that would characterize his rule. Most importantly, he learned what had destroyed his father and brother. Weakness and mercy were fatal in Wallachia. To hold power, he would need to be more ruthless than his rivals, more feared than his enemies, more willing to commit atrocities. Terror would be his weapon, and he would wield it without hesitation or remorse. In 1456, opportunity finally came. The current Prince of Wallachia, Vladislav II, had proven unreliable to both Hungarian and Ottoman interests. Various factions began looking for alternatives. Vlad, now 25 years old and commanding support from Transylvanian nobles and Hungarian officials, saw his chance. In the summer of 1456, Vlad invaded Wallachia with military support from Hungarian authorities. He defeated Vladislav II in battle, reportedly killing his rival personally in single combat. He seized the throne and rode into Targovište as Prince of Wallachia, ruler of the land his father had lost, avenger of his family's deaths. This time, he was ready. This time, he would not be overthrown. This time, he would rule with an iron fist, crushing anyone who opposed him, using methods so brutal that his enemies would fear him more than they feared death itself. This time, he would become Vlad the Impaler, the Prince of Terror. When Vlad took power in 1456, Wallachia was in chaos. The nobility, the boyar class, had grown powerful and fractious during decades of weak rulers. These boyars owned vast estates, commanded private armies, and treated the throne as a prize to be controlled through their intrigues. They had betrayed and murdered multiple princes, including Vlad's own father and brother. The common people suffered under boyar oppression and the predations of bandits. Trade was disrupted by lawlessness. The treasury was empty. The army was disorganized and poorly equipped. Ottoman tax collectors roamed the land demanding tribute, while Hungarian officials expected their own payments and favors. Vlad recognized that traditional methods of rule would fail. Previous princes had tried to govern through alliances with powerful boyar families, balancing one faction against another. But these alliances were temporary and fragile, always vulnerable to betrayal. Vlad decided on a radically different approach. He would break the boyar class entirely, replacing them with men who owed their positions solely to him. His first major action as prince was characteristically brutal and became one of the most famous incidents of his reign. In the spring of 1459, Vlad invited the leading boyar families of Wallachia to an Easter feast at his palace in Târgoviște. It was customary for the prince to celebrate Easter with his nobles, and the invitation seemed normal enough. The boyars arrived in their finest clothes with their families, expecting a celebration. The palace was decorated for the holy day. Food and wine were prepared. The atmosphere seemed festive. But after the meal concluded, Vlad's soldiers surrounded the hall, blocking all exits. Vlad rose and addressed his assembled nobles. He asked them a question. How many princes of Wallachia had they known in their lifetimes? The older boyars answered proudly, some claiming to have lived through 7 or 8 reigns. They boasted of their longevity and their families' enduring power. Vlad then accused them of being responsible for the instability that plagued Wallachia. He claimed they had murdered or overthrown prince after prince for their own advantage, that they had betrayed his father and brother, that they were parasites who grew fat while the country suffered. Then he gave orders that shocked even his own soldiers. The older boyars, those who had boasted of knowing many princes, were arrested along with their families and marched outside the city walls. There, Vlad's men impaled them on wooden stakes, planting the stakes upright so the victims died slowly over hours, sometimes days, suspended in agony where all could see them. The younger and healthier boyars received a different punishment. Vlad ordered them to march immediately to Poenari, about 50 miles north, where the ruins of an old fortress stood on a cliff above the Argeș River. They were commanded to rebuild the fortress using their own labor, working without rest. The boyars marched in their fine Easter clothing, carrying stones and timber, constructing walls under the eyes of guards who beat any who faltered. They worked until their elegant clothes rotted off their bodies. Many died from exhaustion. The survivors found themselves completely broken, stripped of wealth and power, utterly dependent on Vlad's mercy. Poenari Fortress, built with this forced labor on the ruins of an ancient stronghold, became one of Vlad's primary fortresses. Perched dramatically on a cliff with a commanding view of the valley below, it offered a secure refuge if enemies threatened. Today it is known as the real Dracula's Castle, though most tourists associate the vampire legend with Bran Castle instead. With the old boyar families destroyed or subdued, Vlad promoted new men to positions of authority. He chose officials based on competence and loyalty rather than noble birth. This created an administrative class that owed everything to him and nothing to traditional power structures, ensuring their devotion and obedience. But Vlad's most notorious innovation, the practice that earned him the epithet, the Impaler, was his systematic use of impalement as punishment. While impalement was not unknown in 15th century warfare, Ottoman and other forces sometimes using it, Vlad employed the method on a scale, and with an enthusiasm that shocked contemporaries. The process of impalement was deliberately designed to maximize suffering. A wooden stake, carefully smoothed and oiled, would be driven through the victim's body, usually entering through the rectum or genitals and exiting through the shoulder or mouth. The careful preparation of the stake and the skill of the executioner could prolong the dying for many hours, even days in some cases. Vlad reportedly refined the technique with horrible precision. Stakes were prepared to avoid immediately piercing vital organs, extending the victim's agony. Impaled bodies were arranged in geometric patterns outside cities, creating forests of the dying that served as warnings. Vlad sometimes held feasts in the presence of impaled victims, dining calmly while people writhed on stakes around him. the numbers of victims remain disputed. Contemporary accounts, particularly German pamphlets published shortly after Vlad's death, claim he impaled tens of thousands of people during his 6-year reign. These numbers are likely exaggerated, produced by Vlad's enemies to blacken his reputation. But even conservative estimates suggest thousands died through impalement alone, an extraordinary number for a principality as small as Wallachia. Who were the victims? Some were criminals, as Vlad made impalement the punishment for almost every crime from major theft to lying. Political enemies faced the stakes, including rival boyars and foreign merchants who angered him. Ottoman prisoners of war were impaled by the hundreds after battles and raids. Entire towns that resisted his rule or failed to pay taxes were subjected to mass impalement. Even women and children were not spared if Vlad deemed punishment necessary. One account describes him impaling mothers with their nursing infants attached to the same stake. Another tells of impaling women for adultery or sexual impropriety. The cruelty was systematic and applied without regard for age, gender, or social status. German pamphlets from the 1470s and 80s depicted Vlad dining among forests of impaled corpses, calmly eating breakfast while victims screamed around him. These woodcut illustrations were propaganda, designed to horrify readers and demonstrate Vlad's monstrosity. But they drew on real events that eyewitnesses had described, events considered shocking, even by the standards of a brutal century. One famous story tells of Ottoman envoys who refused to remove their turbans in Vlad's presence, citing religious custom. Vlad reportedly replied that he would help them honor their custom more firmly by nailing the turbans to their heads, which he then did with iron nails. Whether literally true or embellished, the story captured Vlad's reputation for creative and merciless cruelty. Another tale describes Vlad inviting all the poor, sick, and elderly of his realm to a great feast in Targovishte. After they had eaten their fill, Vlad asked if they wished to be free of their troubles and worries. When they enthusiastically agreed, he ordered the hall bolted shut and set on fire, burning everyone inside. His stated reason was to free them from poverty and to prevent them from becoming burdens on society. Modern historians debate how much of this is true versus propaganda. The German pamphlets in particular were essentially medieval political hit pieces, produced to portray Vlad as a monster. Many stories may be exaggerated or entirely invented, but even accounting for bias and exaggeration, enough evidence from multiple independent sources confirms that Vlad used terror systematically, and at a scale unusual even for his era. Why such extreme cruelty? Some historians argue Vlad was simply a sadist who enjoyed inflicting pain. But this explanation seems too simple. Vlad's cruelty was purposeful and politically calculated. He used terror as a tool of governance in a situation where conventional methods would fail. Wallachia was small and poor, unable to field a large army or pay for extensive fortifications. Vlad could not match the Ottomans in military might or compete with Hungarian resources, but he could make the cost of opposing him so high that even powerful enemies would hesitate. Impalement sent a clear message: I am more ruthless than you. I will do things you cannot stomach. Cross me, and you will die slowly and publicly, serving as a permanent warning to others. This strategy worked, at least temporarily. Vlad's reputation for cruelty preceded him. Enemy soldiers feared facing him. Potential rebels calculated carefully before acting. But Vlad's reign was not purely about terror. He also established law and order with an effectiveness that bordered on the obsessive. Crime rates dropped dramatically because even minor theft was punishable by death. Merchants could travel safely because bandits were systematically hunted down and impaled. Corruption virtually disappeared because officials caught taking bribes faced immediate execution. A famous legend, possibly apocryphal but widely believed, states that Vlad placed a golden cup at a public fountain in Targovishte. Anyone could use the cup to drink water, but the cup remained there unguarded year after year. No one dared steal it because everyone knew the punishment. Whether true or not, the story illustrates how Vlad's reputation for harsh justice created order through fear. Vlad also took decisive action against Ottoman influence in Wallachia. He stopped paying the annual tribute to Sultan Mehmed II, a bold and dangerous move. When Ottoman tax collectors arrived demanding payment, Vlad had them executed, their bodies impaled as messages to their superiors. He launched raids across the Danube into Ottoman territory, burning villages and impaling any Ottomans his forces captured. These actions delighted Christian Europe, which saw Vlad as a crusader fighting the infidel. Pope Pius II praised Vlad's resistance to Ottoman expansion. King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, despite later betraying Vlad, initially supported him as a valuable bulwark against Muslim incursion into Christian lands. But Vlad's defiance also made war inevitable. The Ottoman Empire was the most powerful military force in the region, perhaps in the world. Sultan Mehmed II, who had conquered Constantinople in 1453 and ended the Byzantine Empire, would not tolerate a vassal state murdering his officials and refusing tribute. The confrontation that would define Vlad's legend and lead ultimately to his downfall was approaching. In 1462, the Sultan decided to deal with the Wallachian problem permanently. He assembled a massive army and prepared to invade. Vlad, vastly outnumbered, would have to rely on cunning, ruthlessness, and terror to survive. War with the Sultan. In the spring of 1462, Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople and terror of Christian Europe, assembled an army to crush Wallachian resistance once and for all. Historical estimates of the force vary widely, ranging from 40,000 to 90,000 men, but even the lower estimates vastly outnumbered anything Vlad could field. The Sultan's strategy was straightforward: invade Wallachia, defeat Vlad's forces, and install Radu, Vlad's brother, who had remained loyal to the Ottomans, as the new prince. Vlad knew he could not win a conventional battle against such overwhelming force. His army numbered perhaps 25 to 30,000 men at most, many of them peasant levies with minimal training. But Vlad had advantages the Sultan lacked: intimate knowledge of Wallachian terrain, the ability to move quickly with light forces, and absolutely no moral constraints on his methods of warfare. As the Ottoman army crossed the Danube River and began advancing north into Wallachia in early summer, Vlad immediately implemented a scorched earth strategy. His forces retreated before the massive Ottoman host, but they left nothing behind that could sustain an army. Wells were poisoned with lime and corpses, crops were burned in the fields, livestock was driven away or slaughtered, villages were destroyed to prevent their use as shelter. The Ottomans found themselves marching through a devastated wasteland. Every source of food and water had been contaminated or removed. The advancing army, tens of thousands of men and horses, needed enormous quantities of supplies, but they found nothing. Soldiers began falling ill from poisoned water. Hunger weakened the troops. The pace of advance slowed as the logistics became increasingly difficult. Meanwhile, Vlad's light cavalry conducted constant harassment. Small units of horsemen appeared without warning, attacking supply trains, ambushing stragglers, raiding camps at night. The Ottomans could never rest, never feel secure. Sentries disappeared, scouts were found dead, often impaled on crude stakes as psychological warfare. The army's morale began to crack under the constant pressure. Then Vlad implemented his most audacious plan: a night raid directly on the Ottoman camp, with the specific goal of killing Sultan Mehmed II himself. If the Sultan died, the invasion would collapse as Ottoman commanders fought for succession rather than conquering Wallachia. On the night of June 17, 1462, Vlad personally led approximately 10,000 cavalry in a surprise attack on the Ottoman encampment. His scouts had identified the location of the Sultan's tent, and Vlad's plan was to strike directly at the center of Ottoman power. The raid began after midnight, when most of the camp slept. Vlad's horsemen stormed through the outer pickets, killing sentries before they could raise an alarm. They penetrated deep into the camp, spreading chaos and panic. Ottoman soldiers woke to find enemy cavalry among them, slashing and stabbing in the darkness, unable to distinguish friend from foe in the confusion. Vlad's men killed thousands in the initial assault, cutting through the camp toward the Sultan's position. According to some accounts, Vlad came within yards of Mehmed's tent before the Sultan's elite guard rallied and drove the attackers back. The raid did not achieve its ultimate goal of killing the Sultan, but it came terrifyingly close. The psychological impact was perhaps greater than the military effect. Sultan Mehmed II had fought countless battles across 3 continents. He had faced crusades and rebellions. He had conquered the greatest city in Christendom, but he had never encountered an enemy as ruthless and unpredictable as Vlad. The night attack, as it became known, shook the Sultan's confidence and made him reassess the costs of this campaign. The Ottoman army continued advancing toward Targovishte, but their pace was slow and their losses mounted daily. Then they encountered something that broke their morale entirely and entered history as one of the most infamous images of medieval warfare. As Mehmed's army approached the Wallachian capital, the road before them became lined with wooden stakes. On those stakes were impaled the bodies of 20,000 Ottoman prisoners, captives taken in raids and battles over the previous year. The corpses had been there for weeks or months in some cases, creating a forest of death stretching for nearly 2 miles. Some bodies were fresh, recently impaled, and still dying when the Ottoman army arrived. Others had been there long enough to decompose to skeletons, birds and insects picking the bones clean. All were arranged in careful geometric patterns, creating avenues of death that the Ottoman army had to march through to reach Targovishte. The sight and smell were overwhelming. Ottoman soldiers, hardened veterans of countless battles, turned away in horror and revulsion. Many vomited. Some refused to advance further. The psychological impact of this deliberate display of mass death was devastating. Sultan Mehmed II himself reportedly said that he could not take a land from a man who did such things, who used such methods to defend his country. How could he defeat an enemy willing to commit such atrocities? What would Vlad do if the Ottomans actually managed to occupy Wallachia? The forest of the impaled was a message. This is what awaits you if you continue. The Ottoman invasion did not immediately collapse, but it stalled. Mehmed left a substantial force under the command of his brother-in-law and Vlad's brother Radu, then returned to Constantinople with the bulk of his army. The campaign had failed to achieve its objective. Vlad, vastly outnumbered, had forced the most powerful military empire in the region to withdraw. But Vlad's victory was Pyrrhic. The Ottomans left enough troops to continue pressure on Wallachia. Radu actively campaigned for the throne with Ottoman backing, appealing to Wallachian nobles tired of Vlad's brutal rule. Vlad found himself fighting a civil war against his own brother, while also defending against continued Ottoman military operations. Moreover, Vlad's tactics had devastated Wallachia. The scorched earth policy had destroyed the economy. Thousands of Wallachians had died in the fighting, or from starvation. The population was exhausted and traumatized. The country could not sustain continued warfare at this intensity. Desperate for support, Vlad turned to King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, reminding him of their alliance and their shared Christian duty to resist Ottoman expansion. Vlad sent letters describing his victories, his need for reinforcements and supplies, his willingness to continue the fight if properly supported. But Matthias had decided that Vlad was more trouble than he was worth. Relations with the Ottoman Empire were complex, and Hungary needed stability on its southern border more than it needed a rebellious vassal prince creating constant conflict. In late 1462, when Vlad crossed into Transylvania seeking Hungarian support, Matthias's forces arrested him. Matthias brought Vlad to Buda and imprisoned him in the royal castle. To justify this betrayal of an ally, Matthias produced letters allegedly proving that Vlad had been negotiating secretly with the Ottomans, planning to betray the Christian cause. Most historians believe these letters were forgeries created by Matthias to excuse his treachery. The real reasons were political and pragmatic. Vlad spent the next 12 years, from 1462 to 1474, as Matthias's prisoner. During this time, Radu ruled Wallachia as an Ottoman vassal. Vlad's first great reign was over, ended not by Ottoman conquest, but by Christian betrayal. Yet Vlad made the most of his imprisonment. He learned Hungarian, married into the Hungarian nobility, possibly a relative of Matthias himself, and had children. He maintained his dignity and continued to present himself as a legitimate prince wrongfully imprisoned. He waited for circumstances to change, for his opportunity to return. In 1474, that opportunity arrived. Radu died, and the new Prince of Wallachia proved unreliable to Hungarian interests. Matthias, aging and facing new threats, decided that perhaps Vlad, properly controlled, might be useful once again. Vlad was released from prison after 12 years of captivity. In 1476, with Hungarian backing, Vlad invaded Wallachia for the third time. He defeated his rivals and once again claimed the throne of his ancestors. But this final reign would be brief and tragic. Vlad was older now, in his mid-40s, aged by years of warfare and imprisonment. His support was weak. The Ottomans wanted him dead. Many Wallachians remembered his brutal methods and preferred other rulers. The political situation was as unstable as ever. In December 1476, or January 1477, the exact date uncertain, Vlad fought a battle against Ottoman forces and Wallachian rebels near Bucharest. The details of the battle and Vlad's death are murky and contradictory. Some accounts say he died fighting bravely against overwhelming odds. Others suggest he was assassinated by his own men who had grown tired of endless warfare. What is certain is that Vlad was killed. His head was cut off and sent to Constantinople, where Sultan Mehmed II, now in his mid-40s himself, displayed it on a stake as proof that his most persistent enemy was finally dead. The head that had commanded such terror was now just another trophy, a warning to other potential rebels. Vlad's body was supposedly buried at Snagov Monastery, an island monastery on a lake north of Bucharest. Archaeological excavations in the 20th century failed to definitively identify his remains, adding mystery to his final resting place. Perhaps his bones lie there still. Perhaps they were moved or destroyed. Like so much about Vlad, even his death remains shrouded in uncertainty and legend. Vlad III of Wallachia, Vlad Dracula, Vlad the Impaler died as he had lived, violently surrounded by enemies, fighting to the end. He was approximately 45 years old. His life had been marked by exceptional cruelty and fierce independence. He had resisted the most powerful empire of his age, ruled through terror, and become a legend even before his death. But this was not the end of his story. In fact, it was only the beginning. The man was dead, but the legend was about to be born. From medieval prince to Gothic monster. For several centuries after his death, Vlad Dracula remained a relatively obscure figure outside Romanian lands. In Romania and surrounding regions, his memory lived on in folk tales and oral traditions. These stories presented him ambiguously, as both a cruel tyrant who ruled through fear and a strong leader who had defended his people against foreign enemies. The German pamphlets from the late 15th century, with their lurid woodcut illustrations of Vlad dining among impaled corpses, circulated in parts of Central Europe. These were among the first mass-produced printed materials with images, primitive by modern standards but shocking and effective for their time. They portrayed Vlad as a monster, a cautionary tale about power unchecked by Christian virtue. But these pamphlets were specialized publications, not widely distributed beyond certain regions and scholarly circles. Ottoman chronicles mentioned Vlad as a troublesome enemy who had finally been defeated, but he was one of many rebellious Christian princes, not particularly noteworthy in the broader sweep of Ottoman conquests. Hungarian records remembered him as a complicated ally who had proven more difficult than useful. For 3.5 centuries, Vlad remained a local legend, important in Romanian historical memory, but largely unknown to the wider world. Then everything changed in the late 19th century when an Irish writer named Abraham Bram Stoker began researching vampire legends for a Gothic novel. Stoker, born in 1847 in Dublin, was fascinated by folklore and supernatural tales. He worked as a theater manager in London, managing the famous Lyceum Theatre for actor Henry Irving. In his spare time, he wrote fiction, including horror stories that reflected the Victorian era's obsession with death, sexuality, and the supernatural. By the 1890s, Stoker was planning an ambitious novel about vampires, the undead creatures of Eastern European folklore. He researched extensively, reading travel books about Transylvania, studying vampire legends from various cultures, and searching for authentic details that would ground his supernatural story in believable reality. During his research at the British Library in London, Stoker encountered a book called An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia by William Wilkinson, published in 1820. This obscure travel memoir mentioned Vlad Dracula, describing him as a Wallachian prince known for his cruelty. The book noted that Dracula meant devil in the local language, a fact that immediately captured Stoker's imagination. Stoker had originally planned to name his vampire character Count Wampir and set the story in Styria, Austria. But discovering the name Dracula and learning about Transylvania's dark forests and medieval castles, Stoker changed his plans. He would use this historical name and relocate his story to the Carpathian Mountains. This decision, made somewhat casually during the research phase, would forever link the historical Vlad with the fictional vampire. Stoker's novel Dracula was published in 1897. The story follows Count Dracula, an ancient vampire living in a castle in Transylvania, who travels to England to spread his curse of vampirism. A group of heroes, led by Professor Abraham Van Helsing, pursues the Count back to Transylvania and destroys him. Stoker's Count Dracula bears little resemblance to the historical Vlad beyond the name and Transylvanian setting. The Count is an immortal supernatural creature who drinks blood to sustain himself, transforms into a bat or wolf, casts no reflection in mirrors, fears crucifixes and garlic, and cannot enter a home uninvited. None of these attributes have anything to do with the historical Vlad Dracula, who was entirely mortal and died permanently in 1476 or 1477. Stoker did include a few historical details. In the novel, Count Dracula mentions fighting against the Turks, a reference to Vlad's wars against the Ottoman Empire. The Count speaks of a family history of defending Christian lands. But these are minor touches, vague allusions that do not seriously engage with historical reality. The novel was not immediately a massive bestseller. Initial reviews were mixed, with some critics praising Stoker's atmospheric writing, while others found the story sensational and crude. But the novel gradually found an audience, particularly after Stoker adapted it for the stage in 1897 to establish copyright. Stoker died in 1912, never knowing that his novel would become a classic, or that Count Dracula would become perhaps the most famous vampire in world literature. The character's true popularity began after Stoker's death, particularly through film adaptations. The first major film adaptation was F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu in 1922, though this unauthorized German production changed names to avoid copyright issues. The vampire was called Count Orlok rather than Dracula, and the filmmakers were sued by Stoker's widow. But the film established the visual language of vampire cinema, the gaunt, menacing figure, the castle on the mountain, the supernatural horror invading the modern world. The definitive early portrayal came in 1931 with Todd Browning's Dracula, starring Hungarian actor Bela Lugosi. Lugosi's performance established the image of Dracula that persists in popular culture, the aristocratic vampire in evening clothes with his distinctive accent, formal manners, and hypnotic presence. Lugosi became so identified with the role that he was eventually buried wearing his Dracula cape. Through the 20th century, Dracula appeared in countless adaptations and reimaginings. Christopher Lee played him as more overtly violent and sexual in a series of Hammer films, beginning in 1958. These films emphasized gothic horror and made explicit the erotic subtext that had always been present in vampire fiction. Francis Ford Coppola's 1992 film, Bram Stoker's Dracula, connected the vampire more explicitly to the historical Vlad. The film opens with a prologue showing Vlad as a 15th century warrior defending Christian Europe against the Turks. When his wife commits suicide after receiving false news of his death, Vlad renounces God and becomes a vampire, cursed to immortal life sustained by blood. This origin story was Coppola's invention, not part of Stoker's novel or historical reality. But it firmly established in popular consciousness the connection between Vlad the Impaler and Dracula the vampire. Since Coppola's film, most people encountering the name Dracula assume a direct link between the historical prince and the supernatural creature. Romanian folklore does include beliefs about vampires or vampire-like creatures. The strigoi were undead beings who rose from graves to drain life from the living. The moroi were living people with supernatural powers. These beliefs were common throughout Eastern Europe and had nothing specifically to do with Vlad Dracula. But Vlad's name carried ominous connotations. Dracula, meaning son of the dragon or son of the devil, seemed perfect for a supernatural villain. His historical reputation for cruelty, his association with death and impalement, his dramatic life and mysterious burial all created an aura of darkness that made him suitable for Gothic horror. Bram Stoker synthesized these elements. He took the historical name Dracula, added Eastern European vampire folklore, set the story in the atmospheric landscape of Transylvania, and created a character that has endured for more than a century, spawning hundreds of adaptations, sequels, and reimaginings. The irony is that Vlad Dracula and vampires had no connection in Romanian tradition. The association exists purely because of Stoker's novel. Yet this literary creation has become so powerful that most people worldwide associate Dracula with vampires rather than with medieval Romanian history. This creates complications for Romanian cultural identity and tourism. On one hand, the Dracula connection brings international attention and tourist revenue. Bran Castle, which has only a tenuous historical connection to Vlad, is marketed as Dracula's Castle and attracts hundreds of thousands of visitors annually who want to see where the fictional vampire supposedly lived. The Romanian government and tourism industry have embraced this connection pragmatically, recognizing its economic value even while acknowledging its fictional nature. Vlad has been marketed as the real Dracula, with tours visiting supposed sites from his life, restaurants serving Dracula's dinner, and countless souvenirs playing on the vampire theme. But this commercialization comes at a cost. The complex historical reality of Vlad Dracula, a figure who deserves to be understood in his 15th century context, is obscured by vampire kitsch. Tourists come expecting Gothic horror and miss the actual history, which is arguably more interesting than the fiction. Moreover, the vampire association has influenced how Vlad is perceived historically. Because people associate his name with supernatural evil, they tend to view the historical Vlad as purely monstrous, overlooking the political and military contexts that shaped his actions. The fictional monster casts a shadow over the historical man. Some Romanians resent this. They see Vlad as a national hero who defended Romanian independence during a dark period, and they dislike his reduction to a cartoon vampire. Others embrace the Dracula connection pragmatically, recognizing that it brings attention to Romanian culture and history that might otherwise be ignored by international audiences. The transformation from historical prince to literary vampire reveals much about how legends are created and how historical memory works. Vlad's actual life, dramatic and brutal as it was not enough. The story needed to be transformed, made supernatural, connected to deeper psychological fears and desires. Only then could a 15th century Wallachian prince become a global icon. This process of transformation continues. Each new adaptation of Dracula reimagines the character for contemporary audiences, reflecting current anxieties and values. Modern vampires are often portrayed as tragic anti-heroes rather than pure evil, reflecting our culture's preference for moral complexity. Some recent portrayals make Dracula sympathetic, even romantic, a far cry from the purely evil monster of earlier versions. Meanwhile, historical scholarship on the real Vlad continues, with Romanian and international historians examining the fragmentary sources, debating his motivations and actions, trying to separate fact from legend. But this scholarly work remains largely unknown to general audiences, who encounter Dracula primarily through fiction rather than history. The question arises, does it matter? Is there value in distinguishing the historical Vlad from the fictional count? Or are both simply stories we tell ourselves, one claiming to be history and the other admitting its fictional nature? The answer is that both matter, but in different ways. The fictional Dracula serves important cultural functions, allowing us to explore fears about death, sexuality, and otherness through the safety of supernatural fiction. The historical Vlad forces us to confront actual human capacity for cruelty, the complexities of political power, and how we judge historical figures who live by very different moral codes. By understanding both the man and the myth, we gain insight into how history becomes legend, how names carry meanings across centuries, and how a medieval prince's reputation for cruelty transformed him into immortality of a different kind than he ever imagined. The ambiguous legacy. In Romania today, Vlad Dracula occupies a complicated place in national memory. He is simultaneously a historical figure, a national symbol, and a tourist attraction. How Romanians view him depends largely on which aspect they emphasize and what values they prioritize. During the communist era, from 1947 to 1989, the Romanian government actively promoted Vlad as a national hero. Communist leader Nicolae Ceausescu, himself a brutal dictator, saw Vlad as a useful historical precedent. Here was a strong ruler who had resisted foreign domination, established centralized authority, and crushed opposition without mercy. Under communist rule, Vlad was celebrated in schools, commemorated with statues, and presented in history books as a defender of Romanian independence. His cruelty was downplayed or justified as necessary given the circumstances. His resistance to the Ottoman Empire was emphasized as patriotic heroism. He became an official national hero, a symbol of Romanian strength and resistance to foreign control. This rehabilitation of Vlad's image served the communist regime's purposes. It provided historical justification for authoritarian rule, suggested that strong leaders sometimes had to use harsh methods, and promoted nationalist sentiments that the government could channel for its own benefit. After communism fell in 1989, Romanian society began reassessing many aspects of its history, including the Vlad legacy. Some Romanians continued to view him as a hero who had defended Romanian lands during a difficult period. They argued that his methods, while brutal, were necessary to maintain independence against powerful enemies. They pointed out that the Ottoman Empire was not gentle in its conquests, and that resisting such a power required extreme measures. This heroic interpretation emphasizes several historical facts. Vlad did resist Ottoman expansion when many other rulers submitted. He did establish law and order, even through brutal methods. He did defend Wallachian independence during his reigns. From a nationalist perspective, these achievements outweigh the cruelty, or at least explain it. But other Romanians reject this heroic view. They point out that many of Vlad's victims were his own subjects, not foreign enemies. The boyars massacred on Easter were Wallachians. The poor burned in the hall were Wallachians. The thousands impaled for various offenses were mostly inhabitants of Wallachia. Vlad's terror was directed as much against his own people as against external threats. These critics argue that defending Vlad as a hero requires overlooking or minimizing atrocities that would be condemned if committed by rulers from other nations. They suggest that nationalist pride should not blind us to historical crimes, that we can acknowledge Romanian history without celebrating brutal dictators. This debate reflects larger questions about how nations should remember problematic historical figures. Should we judge historical people by the standards of their own time, or by modern ethical principles? Should nationalist narratives emphasize heroes and downplay their flaws? How do we balance historical understanding with moral judgment? Different historians and scholars have taken various positions on these questions. Some argue for understanding Vlad in his 15th century context, when brutality was common and rulers were expected to use harsh methods. They point out that other European rulers of that era, such as Richard III of England or Louis XI of France, also had reputations for cruelty. Ottoman sultans regularly executed thousands after conquering cities. By medieval standards, Vlad was severe, but not entirely exceptional. This contextualist approach suggests we should judge historical figures by the norms of their own societies, rather than imposing modern values retrospectively. From this perspective, Vlad was a product of his violent era, shaped by trauma and circumstances that modern people fortunately do not face. But other scholars reject this relativism. They argue that even by medieval standards, Vlad's cruelty was exceptional. The German pamphlets written by people familiar with medieval warfare found his methods shocking. Contemporary accounts from multiple sources describe mass impalements that went beyond normal practices. Ottoman officials, hardly strangers to brutality, were horrified by the forest of the impaled. Moreover, these critics argue there is a difference between understanding historical context and excusing historical crimes. We can acknowledge that 15th century warfare was brutal while still recognizing that Vlad took cruelty to extremes. Understanding why he acted as he did is not the same as justifying or celebrating those actions. The numbers matter in this debate. Even if we significantly reduce the casualty claims made by hostile sources, Vlad likely killed tens of thousands during his 6 years of actual rule. For a principality with a population of perhaps 500,000, this represents a significant portion of the population. The demographic impact on Wallachia was substantial. Some psychologists and historians have attempted to analyze Vlad's psychology, though such efforts remain speculative given the limited sources. Some suggest he suffered what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder from his years as an Ottoman hostage, that witnessing and experiencing brutality warped his psychological development. Others propose that Vlad exhibited traits consistent with psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder: lack of empathy, inability to form emotional bonds, willingness to harm others for personal gain, superficial charm when useful. The stories of him dining among impaled corpses, if accurate, suggest someone who not only tolerated cruelty, but took pleasure in it. But amateur psychological diagnosis of historical figures is problematic and ultimately speculative. We cannot psychoanalyze someone who lived 500 years ago based on fragmentary and biased sources. What we can say is that Vlad demonstrated exceptional willingness to use terror, showed minimal mercy in historical records, and employed methods that shocked even his brutal contemporaries. Perhaps the most balanced assessment is that Vlad was a complex figure who cannot be reduced to simple categories of hero or monster. He was a medieval ruler facing impossible political pressures who chose to respond with extreme brutality. His methods secured his power temporarily and defended Wallachian independence briefly, but at tremendous cost in human suffering. He was neither a misunderstood hero nor a supernatural monster. He was a mortal man who made choices that we can examine and judge while recognizing the historical context that shaped those choices. We can acknowledge his military skills and political determination while also condemning his cruelty and recognizing its impact on thousands of victims. The ongoing debate about Vlad's legacy reflects not just disagreements about 15th century history, but broader questions about nationalism, historical memory, and how we reckon with problematic aspects of our past. These questions have no easy answers, and reasonable people can disagree about how to balance understanding with judgment, context with morality. What seems clear is that Vlad Dracula will remain a contested figure, interpreted differently by different audiences depending on their values and priorities. Romanian nationalists will continue emphasizing his resistance to foreign domination. Human rights advocates will continue pointing to his victims. Scholars will continue debating the sources and contexts. Tourists will continue visiting castles associated with his name, many more interested in vampire fiction than historical reality. And through all these interpretations and reimaginings, the historical Vlad remains elusive, a figure glimpsed through fragmentary sources and centuries of accumulated legend, forever obscured by the vampire that bears his name. What the legend reveals: the transformation of Vlad Dracula from medieval prince to literary vampire and pop culture icon reveals profound truths about how humans remember the past, create myths, and use historical figures for contemporary purposes. The story is not just about one man, but about how memory works and what we choose to preserve across generations. Consider what aspects of Vlad's life have survived strongest in popular consciousness. Not his political achievements, diplomatic skills, or administrative reforms. Not his strategic brilliance or his success in maintaining independence against overwhelming odds. What survived is the cruelty, the impalement, the forests of corpses, the dining among the dead, the image of a ruler who inspired absolute terror. This tells us something important about human psychology and historical memory. We remember the extreme, the shocking, the horrifying more readily than we remember the mundane, even when the mundane is historically more significant. A competent administrator is forgotten. A mass killer is remembered. Extremity burns itself into cultural memory in ways that ordinary competence cannot. But the memory transforms. Real historical cruelty, with its political purposes and cultural context, becomes simplified into pure evil. Vlad becomes a monster in the metaphorical sense, a creature beyond normal human morality. And eventually, this metaphor becomes literal. He becomes an actual monster, a vampire. This transformation serves psychological purposes. By making Vlad supernatural, we externalize the horror. We place him outside normal human categories. We no longer have to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that an ordinary human being, facing circumstances not entirely unique, chose to commit atrocities. We can say he was a monster and mean it literally, avoiding the more disturbing recognition that humans are capable of monstrous acts without being supernatural. The vampire Dracula is safely other. He is not human in the normal sense. We can fear him, fight him, destroy him in fiction without confronting the harder questions about human nature, about what ordinary people might do under extreme circumstances, about how trauma and power corrupt. This is not unique to Dracula. Many historical figures associated with great evil eventually become fictionalized or mythologized in ways that make them less human, less real. They become symbols, archetypes, embodiments of pure evil that can be safely condemned without deeper reflection. The cost of this transformation is that we lose historical understanding. When we turn Vlad into a vampire, we lose the opportunity to understand what actually happened in 15th century Wallachia and why. We lose the chance to learn from history about how political pressures and trauma shape behavior, how ordinary humans become capable of extraordinary cruelty, how we might prevent similar patterns from recurring. The fictional Dracula provides entertaining horror, but teaches us nothing about medieval politics, trauma psychology, or the complexities of moral judgment in impossible situations. The historical Vlad, properly understood in context, offers genuine insights into human behavior and political power, even if those insights are uncomfortable. The Dracula story also reveals how different cultures remember the same figure for different purposes. In Romania, Vlad is often a national hero, symbol of resistance to foreign domination. In Western popular culture, he is a monster, embodiment of supernatural evil. Neither image is entirely accurate, but each serves the needs of its culture. Romanian nationalism needs heroes who defended independence, even if those heroes were imperfect. Vlad fills that need, though his cruelty must be minimized or justified. Western popular culture needs compelling villains and gothic anti-heroes. Dracula fills that need, though the historical figure must be transformed beyond recognition. These different memories coexist because they serve different functions. Romanian schoolchildren learn about Vlad the Defender. Western children learn about Dracula the Vampire. Both are real in the sense that they shape how people understand history and fiction. Both are incomplete, emphasizing some aspects while ignoring others. The persistence of the Dracula story across more than a century reveals something about human fascination with darkness. We are drawn to horror, to monsters, to controlled exploration of fear. The vampire, a creature that is both dead and alive, that was human but is no longer, that drinks blood to sustain itself, taps into deep psychological anxieties about death, transformation, and predation. Dracula endures because he embodies fears that remain relevant across generations. Fear of death and what comes after. Fear of losing our humanity. Fear of predators who look human but are not. He also embodies certain dark desires: immortality, power over others, freedom from moral constraints, sexual allure without consequences. The recent popularity of sympathetic or romantic vampires reflects contemporary values. Modern audiences prefer moral complexity over simple good versus evil narratives. We live in an age skeptical of absolute judgments, comfortable with ambiguity. Modern vampires struggle with their nature, seek redemption, deserve love despite being monsters. This would have bewildered both Bram Stoker and the historical Vlad, but it reveals how the story continues evolving. The ultimate lesson of the Dracula story is that historical figures often become myths that reflect the needs and values of those who remember them more than the reality of the people themselves. Vlad Dracula. The 15th century prince exists in fragmentary sources that scholars can study and debate. But Dracula, the cultural icon, exists in collective imagination, shaped by countless retellings, serving purposes its historical namesake never imagined. Both are real in different ways. The historical Vlad was real in the sense that he lived, breathed, ruled, killed, and died. The legendary Dracula is real in the sense that he shapes how millions of people understand vampires, Romania, and Gothic horror. One belongs to history, the other to myth, but both continue to influence how we see the world. The transformation from man to monster teaches us about the power of storytelling and the flexibility of memory. It shows us how names carry meanings across centuries, how reputations outlie their owners, how fiction and history intertwine in the cultural consciousness. Most importantly, it reminds us that we are constantly remaking the past in the image of the present, selecting what to remember and what to forget, what to celebrate and what to condemn, what to preserve and what to transform. Vlad Dracula, whoever he really was beneath the layers of propaganda and legend, has achieved a strange immortality, not as a vampire, but as a name that resonates across cultures, a figure who exists simultaneously as historical person, national symbol, and fictional monster. He reminds us that history is not just what happened, but what we make of what happened, how we remember and retell and reimagine the past to serve the needs of the present. The man, the myth, the memory. As our journey through the life and legend of Vlad Dracula draws to a close, we find ourselves standing at the intersection of history and myth, fact and fiction, the medieval past and the modern imagination. We have traveled from 15th century Wallachia to contemporary popular culture, from documented atrocities to vampire fiction, from a brutal prince to the most famous monster in literature. What have we discovered? That Vlad Dracula was a real person who lived in extraordinary times and responded with extraordinary cruelty. That he ruled Wallachia during periods of intense pressure from the Ottoman Empire. That he used terror systematically as a tool of statecraft. That he was remembered differently by different communities, as hero by some and monster by others, depending on their relationship to his actions and their own political needs. We have discovered that an Irish writer named Bram Stoker, researching vampire legends in the late 19th century, encountered Vlad's name and decided to use it for his fictional count. This casual decision created a permanent connection between a medieval prince and a supernatural vampire, a link that has persisted and strengthened over more than a century of films, books, and popular culture. We have discovered that historical memory is flexible and serves contemporary purposes. Vlad the national hero and Vlad the vampire both exist in cultural consciousness, occupying different spaces, speaking to different audiences, revealing different truths about how we remember the past. And we have discovered that the boundary between history and legend is more permeable than we might wish. The historical Vlad shapes the fictional Dracula, while the fictional Dracula influences how we perceive the historical Vlad. They exist in a strange feedback loop, each affecting our understanding of the other. As you lie here now, comfortable and relaxed, preparing for sleep, you can hold both stories in your mind. The historical Vlad, a complex and brutal medieval ruler navigating impossible political pressures, using methods that shock us but that he considered necessary. And the fictional Dracula, the immortal vampire who has frightened and fascinated audiences for generations, reflecting our deepest fears about death and transformation. Both stories have value. The historical narrative teaches us about medieval politics, human psychology under extreme stress, and how we judge past actions. The fictional story entertains us, allows us to explore fear safely, and serves as a mirror for cultural anxieties about power, sexuality, and mortality. The key is not confusing them, not letting vampire fiction completely obscure historical reality, but also not being so focused on scholarly accuracy that we drain all the wonder from the legend. Vlad Dracula, in both his incarnations, captures something profound about human nature, our capacity for both courage and cruelty, our ability to be victims and victimizers, our complexity that resists simple moral categories. If you found this journey into the true story behind the Dracula legend engaging, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. I create content like this several times a week, exploring the real histories behind myths and legends, uncovering the facts that inspired fiction, discovering the complex truths beneath simple stories. Each video is designed to inform your mind while helping your body relax toward restful sleep. Share your thoughts in the comments. Did you know Dracula was based on a real person? Does understanding the history change how you view the vampire legend? What other historical figures transformed into fictional characters would you like to explore? Thank you for traveling with me tonight through medieval Wallachia and Gothic fiction, through historical documents and vampire tales. Thank you for being willing to explore complexity, for appreciating both entertainment and education, for being part of this community that values truth without losing appreciation for storytelling. The real Vlad has been dead for more than 500 years. Whatever his body became, whether it lies at Snagov Monastery or somewhere else entirely, his bones have long since returned to dust. But his name persists, transformed and reimagined, carrying meanings he never intended, inspiring stories he never imagined. The fictional Dracula continues his immortal existence in books, films, television shows, and video games. He has achieved the immortality the historical Vlad never possessed, though in a form that bears little resemblance to the medieval prince who inspired his name. Both Vlads, historical and fictional, remind us that stories are powerful. They shape how we remember the past and how we imagine the future. They reveal our values and our fears. They connect us across centuries, allowing a 15th century prince to matter to people living in the 21st century, though for reasons he could never have anticipated. Rest now, knowing you have discovered something true about the past, that you have separated legend from history, understood the difference between the man and the monster. Rest knowing that the supernatural terrors of fiction and the historical cruelties of the past belong to different worlds than the comfortable present you inhabit. Sleep peacefully, free from both vampires and medieval violence. The creatures of the night are not real, but Vlad was. He lived, fought, ruled, and died. He made choices we can examine and judge. He was human, with all the potential for both greatness and horror that humanity contains. The line between hero and monster, between justified severity and inexcusable cruelty, is thinner than we might wish. It runs through every human heart, not between us and some distant other. Understanding this is perhaps the greatest lesson both the historical prince and the fictional vampire can teach us. Good night, and may your dreams be gentle and your sleep be deep. May you rest knowing that knowledge brings understanding, that truth illuminates rather than frightens, that the stories we tell ourselves about the past reveal as much about the present. The legend of Dracula will continue evolving, retold and reimagined by each generation. But now you know the truth beneath the legend, the historical reality behind the horror fiction. You know that Vlad Dracula was a man, not a monster. And perhaps that knowledge is both more disturbing and more valuable than any vampire tale. Sleep well, knowing that history and fiction both have their place, that we need both entertainment and truth, that understanding the past helps us navigate the present. The story has been told, the truth has been revealed, the legend continues. Good night.